The Hollow Eyes. When Maya and her husband Jack bought the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, they were looking for peace. They had dreamed of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life and creating a new, quiet life in the country. The house was affordable, secluded, and charming. Exactly what they wanted. It was the kind of place that looked picturesque on the surface. An old, weathered farmhouse with ivy creeping up the walls and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. A pond sat quietly in the backyard, surrounded by trees. But there was something off about it, something that didn't sit right in Maya's gut. As they settled in, things seemed normal at first. They unpacked boxes, rearranged furniture, and cleaned up the garden. But soon, Maya began to feel a subtle, creeping unease every time she stepped into the house. At night, she heard faint scratching noises coming from the walls, but Jack dismissed it as the house settling. One evening, as Maya was putting away the last of the dishes in the kitchen, she glanced out of the window and froze. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure. It was a woman, her back turned, her hair long and disheveled. But what made Maya's stomach twist was the fact that the woman's face was turned toward the house, but her eyes were completely hollow, black voids staring into the dark. Maya blinked, and the figure was gone. The next few days felt like a blur of uneventful tasks. Jack seemed oblivious to the discomfort creeping through Maya's mind, and she didn't want to worry him. She told herself it was just stress. Maybe even the isolation of the countryside getting to her. But the strange occurrences continued. One night, as they were about to go to bed, Jack mentioned that he had noticed something odd. A few of the shutters on the windows were slightly ajar, even though they had all been shut earlier that day. Maya was puzzled. They lived in a relatively secure area, and there had been no wind. But when Jack went to check the back door, he found that it had been unlocked. Still, he brushed it off, telling her it was probably just the work of an animal. But Maya could not shake the feeling that someone had been in their home. The days grew longer, and the walls seemed to creak with a life of their own. Maya woke in the middle of the night to hear whispers, faint at first, but growing louder, coming from the walls. The sound was like a breathy murmur, as though someone was trying to speak to her from the other side. One evening, while sitting alone in the living room, she caught sight of movement from the corner of her eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. A shadow moving across the wall, just out of her line of sight. Her heart pounded as she turned her head toward it, but there was nothing there. Things continued to escalate. One afternoon, Maya went into the attic to search for some old linens she had stored away. As she climbed the stairs, she caught a glimpse of something strange in the hallway mirror. Her reflection wasn't quite right. For a moment, the face in the mirror looked too still, too perfect, as though it were not her own. The longer she stared, the more unsettling it became. And then, just before she turned away, Maya's reflection smiled. But she hadn't smiled. Her heart stopped. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched intensified. It felt as though something was lingering just behind her, waiting for her to turn around. At night, she began to see the hollow-eyed woman standing outside the window, staring in at her. And every time she blinked, the figure was closer. By the end of the week, it was standing just a few feet away from the glass. Maya began to spiral. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Her hands were shaking all the time, and she was terrified to be alone in the house. Jack, who had started noticing her erratic behavior, urged her to take a break and leave for a while, but Maya refused. Then, one night, after an entire day of hearing whispers and seeing shadows move out of the corner of her eye, Maya saw her again. The woman with the hollow eyes was standing in the yard, her gaze fixed on the house. This time, Maya could see her more clearly. Her face was pale, gaunt, and her mouth was open as if she was trying to scream. Without thinking, Maya bolted outside, desperate to confront the figure. As she approached, the woman began to turn, her body twisting unnaturally as if her bones were cracking. The woman's head jerked toward Maya, and then with horrifying slowness, she opened her mouth wider than humanly possible. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat, as the woman's eyes locked onto hers. They were black voids, empty pits that swallowed everything around them. Maya's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, unable to look away from those eyes. And then she heard it. A whisper in her mind, clear as day. "Join us." The woman stepped forward, and suddenly, Maya could feel the cold, clammy fingers of something crawling beneath her skin. The ground beneath her began to pulse, and the walls of the house seemed to close in on her. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the woman's voice, now a chorus of voices, whispering from every direction. "You will never leave." The harvesting. In the quiet town of Silverpine, there was an old church, its steeple twisted and weathered, a remnant of an age long past. The locals spoke of it only in hushed tones, the stories of its history buried under years of neglect and mystery. It was said that every 10 years, something dark came from the woods and took what it wanted. The harvest. The elders never explained in detail, only muttered words about the curse and the consequences of disturbing the land. Most of the townsfolk had learned to ignore the old tales, dismissing them as superstition, a relic of the past. But Emily, curious and skeptical, had always wondered about the truth. When Emily's grandfather passed away, she inherited his land near the old church. He had been a recluse, living out his final years alone, away from the bustle of town. He had left her a cryptic note along with the deed to the property, urging her to visit, to understand what has been hidden. The words haunted her, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to make the trip with her 3 closest friends, Jake, Sarah, and Alex. None of them had ever been to the church before, and while they'd heard the rumors, they'd always dismissed them as old tales meant to scare children. This time, however, they would see the place with their own eyes, and whatever it was, no matter how unsettling, it would not scare them. Or so they thought. It was late afternoon when Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Alex arrived at the old church. A thick fog had rolled in, swirling between the trees, and the air had a damp, unnatural stillness to it. The forest surrounding the church felt ancient, as though it had been standing long before the first human foot had touched the earth. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for the sky as if they were part of some ancient, forgotten ritual. The church itself looked as if it had not been touched in decades, its gray stone walls worn and crumbling, the once beautiful stained glass windows now shattered and broken. The front doors, hanging ajar, creaked on their hinges as a gust of wind pushed through the gaps. "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" Jake said, his voice low, as though the fog had muffled his words before they could fully escape. "Let's just get this over with," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. But deep down, her instincts were screaming at her to leave. The place felt like it had a pulse of its own, a living, breathing thing that knew they were there. Inside, the temperature dropped as they crossed the threshold. The air was cold and stale, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The pews were old, covered in dust and cobwebs, untouched for years. But the altar was different, pristine, as though it had been maintained by unseen hands. It seemed out of place in such a desolate, abandoned church. "Why does it look so well kept?" Sarah asked, eyeing the altar suspiciously. "This place looks like it hasn't been touched in forever, except for that." Before Emily could respond, she felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. It was as though someone, or something, was watching her. Her skin crawled, and her heartbeat quickened. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. "Guys," Emily whispered, her voice shaking, "we need to leave." But her friends seemed drawn to the altar, their eyes wide, as if they were under some kind of trance. They moved toward it slowly, almost mechanically, as though something in the church was pulling them in. "Emily, don't be paranoid. It's just an old building," Alex said, his voice distant, as if the fog in the room had started to cloud his mind. "Come on, we're here now. Let's see what's in the basement or something." But Emily's gut told her otherwise. She could feel something shifting in the air, something dark and ancient, a presence that had been waiting for them. She took a step toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The moment they reached the altar, the floor beneath them began to hum. It was faint at first, just a low, almost imperceptible vibration. But as they moved closer, the sound grew louder, more pronounced. The hum became a guttural growl, deep and throbbing, coming from somewhere beneath the earth. Suddenly, the ground cracked. A terrible creaking noise filled the room as the floor split open, revealing a deep, blackened void beneath. From the darkness, pale, withered hands reached out, fingers long and claw-like, grasping for anything they could hold. "Shit! What the hell is happening?" Jake screamed, stumbling backward, his face pale. Before anyone could react, cold, clammy tendrils shot out from the cracks, wrapping around Jake's legs. He screamed again as they pulled him toward the altar, his legs kicking uselessly as he tried to free himself. "Help! Help me!" Jake's voice was strained, desperate, as he fought against the unseen force pulling him toward the darkness. But the more they struggled, the tighter the shadows around them became, as if the very walls of the church were closing in. Alex grabbed Jake's arm, but as he tried to pull him back, something even darker emerged from the pit. Shadowy shapes, slithering and writhing like living creatures made of pure darkness. They seemed to move in a pattern, one that was deliberate and ancient, their cold eyes glowing with a sickly, yellow light. "Get away from him," Sarah shouted, but it was too late. Jake's body was dragged into the abyss, his screams echoing in the dark. The ground closed over him, leaving only the unsettling sound of the earth settling back into place. Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. What the hell is this? What is happening? It wasn't until Alex turned to look at her, his eyes wide, his face pale with terror, that she understood. The harvest had begun. The church, the land, everything around them had been waiting, and they were the crop. "Run!" Emily gasped, her voice cracking. But it was already too late. One by one, Emily watched as her friends were consumed. Sarah was pulled into the shadows, her screams becoming a garbled mess as the tendrils of darkness tangled around her. Alex tried to fight, but the shadows were too strong, and he was soon swallowed whole by the earth. "Emily, please, don't leave me," Sarah cried out, but her voice was cut off, as if the darkness itself had swallowed it. Emily turned to run, but the ground beneath her buckled. She fell, sliding into the same dark abyss that had claimed her friends. She screamed, but no sound came. The world around her spun in a dizzying blur as the walls of the church seemed to twist and stretch, distorting her surroundings. When she hit the ground, it wasn't the cold stone floor of the church. Instead, she found herself outside, in the middle of the forest. The fog had lifted, and the moonlight shone through the trees, illuminating the empty land around her. The church was gone, The fog was gone, but something else was there. In the corner of her eye, Emily saw movement. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast for her to catch. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the area, her breath shallow and rapid. And then she felt it. Cold fingers brushing the back of her neck. She turned, and there they were, the harvesters. They had found her. Their eyes were black pits, hollow and endless, and their faces twisted into shapes that no human face should ever take. The darkness around them seemed to move like liquid, shifting and crawling as if it were alive. One of them reached out, its long, gnarled fingers grasping for her. "Run," Emily whispered to herself, but it was no use. She was already too late. The harvesters closed in, their cold hands grabbing hold of her, pulling her into the abyss. And as Emily's vision faded, the last thing she heard was the low, guttural hum of the land, a sound that echoed from the very depths of the earth. The harvest was not over. The town of Silverpine continued to stand, its secrets buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for the next harvest. The tides of madness. Richard sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, his fingers tracing the edges of the letter. It had arrived that morning, tucked between a pile of bills and research journals. The envelope was plain, unmarked. Nothing about it seemed remarkable at first. But as he read the letter's contents, an unsettling shiver worked its way up his spine. The letter was an invitation, but there were no specifics, no names, no reasons. It simply stated, "We are gathering a select group of researchers for an unprecedented study. The location, a private island, isolated from the world. We believe you possess the skills required to contribute to this experiment. If you are interested, please respond. A boat will be waiting for you on the morning of the 5th. At first, Richard was skeptical. He had received many offers for research opportunities, but none so vague, none so mysterious. Why had they chosen him? He had a reputation in the psychological community, true, but this felt different. The offer felt more like a summons than an invitation. Nevertheless, the idea intrigued him. For years, Richard had studied human behavior under extreme conditions: psychological isolation, confinement, and stress. His most recent research had explored the ways in which the human mind deteriorates when placed under total isolation. And here was an opportunity to observe this phenomenon in real time, in a controlled environment. On a whim, he decided to accept the invitation. What did he have to lose? Richard boarded the boat the next morning. The sea was eerily still, a glassy expanse stretching as far as the eye could see. There was something strange about the water. It seemed too calm, unnaturally so, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. As the boat moved farther from the shore, the island came into view. It was a small, jagged patch of land, surrounded by steep cliffs that plunged into the ocean below. The trees on the island looked twisted, like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. When the boat finally docked, Richard was greeted by a group of other researchers. They were as confused as he was, all equally puzzled by the vague nature of the invitation. Each one had received the same cryptic letter. There was no explanation, no background information. Just the promise of a groundbreaking study. There was Dr. Evelyn Moore, a neuroscientist specializing in human cognition. Marcus Reed, an expert in anthropology and ancient cultures. Sarah Young, a behavioral psychologist. And finally, James Hartley, a biologist. They were all strangers to Richard, but they shared a common air of unease. The strange thing was that none of them seemed to question the island's isolation. It felt as if everyone was too aware of how removed they were from the world outside. The air was thick, as though it carried a weight that settled in your chest. And the island itself, there was something ancient about it, something that didn't belong. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the island, the group was led to a large stone building at the center of the land. It was old, perhaps centuries old, with walls that had long since begun to crumble. Inside, the rooms were sparse, lit only by flickering lamps. There was no warmth here, no sense of comfort. The strange feeling of being watched gnawed at Richard's mind. There were no windows to the outside. The air smelled damp, and the walls seemed to pulse, as though they were alive. As night fell, Richard lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind outside howled, carrying with it an odd sound, a rhythmic crashing, like the sound of waves hitting against rocks. But it was too consistent, too methodical. It didn't sound like the ocean at all. By the second day, Richard began to feel the weight of the island settle into his bones. The air, thick and oppressive, made it hard to breathe. The other researchers, too, seemed affected. Dr. Moore, who had been calm and collected upon their arrival, now wandered the halls with wide, unblinking eyes, as if she were searching for something, though what, she couldn't say. James had stopped speaking altogether. He would only mutter to himself in hushed tones when he thought no one was listening, and Marcus had started writing in his journal obsessively. Every hour, it seemed, they became more distant from one another. Each one withdrew into their own thoughts, each one slowly spiraling. On the third night, the whispering began. Richard awoke to the sound of soft murmurs, almost indistinguishable, but there. They seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first he thought it was the wind, but then the whispers became clearer, louder. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, desperate. He tossed off the covers, feeling the cold sweat on his skin. He crept through the darkened hallways of the stone building, following the whispers. The other researchers stood at the edge of the water, their faces blank, eyes vacant. They stood motionless in a circle, facing outward. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to call out to them, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came. It was as though his voice had been stolen from him. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. The air grew colder, sharper. The ocean before him surged forward, its waves crashing in violent, rhythmic patterns, as if it were alive. The water began to pull back, revealing dark shapes moving beneath the surface. They were not fish, nor any creature Richard had ever seen. They were things. Dark, formless figures, swirling and writhing beneath the water. Richard reached out, trying to shake the others from their trance, but as his hand touched Sarah's shoulder, her head snapped to face him. Her eyes, once filled with life, were now hollow, empty. And then she smiled. Not a normal smile, but a wide, twisted grin stretching unnaturally across her face. "Join us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crashing waves. Richard recoiled, stumbling backward, but before he could move, a cold, powerful force gripped him. The ocean churned even more violently, and the ground beneath his feet gave way. He was being pulled toward the water, dragged against his will. The following days passed in a blur. Richard could no longer tell where the hours began and ended. The island itself seemed to shift around him. Rooms changed places. Paths led to places they hadn't been before. The once familiar faces of his fellow researchers became grotesque caricatures of themselves. Their eyes remained hollow, their bodies stiff, as if they were not quite human anymore. Richard found an old journal in the ruins of a small shack near the cliffs. The journal was written in a hurried, frantic hand. Its pages were stained with ink and what looked like blood. As he read, a growing sense of dread took root in his stomach. The journal spoke of the island's curse, a curse older than any of the researchers, older than the island itself. The first settlers had come to the island centuries ago, seeking refuge from a world that had forgotten them. They found the island, or perhaps it found them, and built a small community. But the island was hungry. It had always been hungry. The journal described rituals, sacrifices made to appease the entity that dwelled beneath the waves. The ocean was not just water, but a living, breathing thing, and it demanded its price, the souls of those who came to the island. The island itself was the prison, the keeper of the damned. As Richard read the final, rambling words, he realized the terrifying truth. The ocean had always been a part of the island. It was the island's heart, its lifeblood, and once it had tasted a soul, it would not let go. In his final moments of clarity, Richard knew what he had to do. He had to escape. But it was too late. The island had already claimed him. The air grew colder as he stood on the edge of the beach, staring out into the darkened waters. The waves churned, crashing violently against the shore. It was a deafening sound, a sound that consumed all thought, all reason. Richard's mind had already begun to break. The whispers had become too loud, too insistent. The faces of his colleagues, his friends, were now distorted, unrecognizable. And through it all, the ocean called to him, its voice a siren song that echoed in the depths of his soul. Richard stepped forward, his legs moving without his consent. The ocean surged forward, its icy fingers reaching for him. He felt them, cold and clammy, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him toward the depths. His breath caught in his throat as the darkness swallowed him whole. As the ocean consumed him, he heard one last whisper, a voice that filled his entire being. "You will never leave." The island fell silent once again, its hunger sated for the time being, and the tides continued to roll, waiting for the next unwitting soul.